Somewhere on the Eurasian steppe in the years before a battle nobody recorded, a rider prepared for war in a way that nobody outside his world had ever seen. No shield, no heavy armor, a short recurved bow built from bone, sinew, and wood, capable of piercing iron at full gallop. And before he mounted, before the lines formed, a small leather pouch was opened. Something was burned, something was inhaled. And the man who climbed onto his horse a few minutes later was not the same man who had opened the pouch. The textbooks will tell you the Scythians were nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppe, who dominated the grasslands between the Black Sea and Central Asia from the 9th century BC to the 3rd, ferocious, mobile, impossible to pin down. They are remembered for their golden artifacts, their mounted archers, their habit of scalping enemies and drinking from the skulls of the men they killed. Herodotus described them in detail. Greek historians were fascinated and afraid. For 2.5 millennia, this has been the outline of the Scythian story. A warrior people who rose, dominated half the known world, and then vanished around 300 BC, absorbed into the populations that replaced them on the steppe. Then ancient DNA was extracted from their bones, and modern toxicology reopened the case. Almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The warriors were not who we were told. The drug was not what historians assumed. The women buried alongside the men were not wives or servants. And more unsettling than any of that, the Scythians never actually disappeared. Their genes are still walking the modern world, and populations spread from Eastern Europe to the mountains of Central Asia. What the DNA revealed is not the story of a lost people. It is the story of a people who were never understood in the first place. To understand what the evidence overturned, you have to first understand what the evidence was overturning. And that means going back to the source, the oldest and most detailed written account of the Scythian world ever committed to paper. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, writing in the 5th century BC, devoted the entire 4th book of his histories to the Scythians. He had traveled the Greek colonies of the northern Black Sea coast. He had spoken with Greeks who lived alongside Scythian communities. He had gathered accounts from merchants who moved through the steppe trade routes. And what he produced was a portrait of such internal consistency and geographic precision that modern archaeology has repeatedly confirmed its accuracy in areas where physical evidence could be checked. The Scythians he described had occupied the grasslands north of the Black Sea for centuries before his time. They were not a settled people. They did not build cities. They did not farm in any fixed sense. Their wealth was measured in horses and cattle, their territory defined by the range of their seasonal migrations, and their military power derived entirely from a combination of mobility and archery that no infantry force of the ancient world had yet found a reliable answer to. The Persian king Darius I had learned this the hard way in 513 BC, when he led an army of perhaps 700,000 men into Scythian territory and found nothing to fight. The Scythians simply moved. They retreated across the steppe, drawing the Persians deeper into an empty landscape, poisoning wells and burning grazing land as they went, until Darius had no choice but to turn back or watch his army starve. It was one of the most complete strategic victories in ancient history, achieved without a single pitched battle. Herodotus described their rituals with the same precision he applied to their tactics. After a victory, a Scythian warrior would drink the blood of the first enemy he killed. He would cut off the scalps of his dead enemies and hang them from his horse's bridle as trophies. The skulls of the most hated enemies were cleaned, lined with leather or gold, and used as drinking cups at feasts. These were not random acts of savagery in Herodotus's telling. They were codified, ritualized. The number of scalps a warrior carried was the measure of his standing in the community. A man with no trophies was a man without status. A man with many was a man whose counsel was sought and whose presence at a feast was honored. Herodotus also described something that subsequent historians would debate for more than 2,000 years, a ceremony performed after the death of a Scythian king. After the burial, the mourners purified themselves. They set up small structures of poles covered in felt. Inside, they placed a brazier of red-hot stones, and then they threw upon the stones the seeds of hemp. And the vapor that rose from those seeds, Herodotus wrote, made the Scythians howl with pleasure. No Greek bath, he added, could match it. This single passage became one of the most discussed observations in all of ancient ethnography. Was it literal? Was it metaphor? Was Herodotus accurately reporting a practice he had heard described? Or was he embellishing for a Greek audience that enjoyed exotic detail? For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, classical scholars treated it as a cultural curiosity. An interesting note from an inquisitive ancient historian, not quite credible, not quite dismissible. A detail that lived in footnotes without ever becoming central to the story. Then someone went looking in the ground. The Paziric burials are among the most remarkable archaeological finds in the history of steppe research. Located in the Altai Mountains of what is now southern Siberia, at altitudes high enough that the permafrost had functioned for more than 2,000 years as a natural deep freeze, these Kurgan burial mounds contained something that burial sites almost never contain. Not just bones, bodies. The permafrost had preserved the soft tissue of the Scythian dead with a precision that left researchers looking at tattooed skin, braided hair, and clothing intact after 25 centuries in the ground. The Scythian woman recovered from the Ukok Plateau in 1993, now known widely as the Ukok Princess or the Ice Maiden, was found buried with 6 horses, a dish of coriander seeds, a wooden container holding a substance that laboratory analysis identified as cannabis, and an elaborate feathered headdress standing nearly 3 feet tall. She was in her mid-20s. Her body was covered in tattoos of extraordinary complexity, stylized animals intertwined across her arms and shoulders in a visual language that was immediately recognizable as the same decorative system found on Scythian gold objects across the entire steppe world. The cannabis was not incidental. Excavations across the Pazyryk complex and at related sites produced braziers, leather pouches, and wooden censers that chemical analysis confirmed had been used to burn hemp. In 2019, researchers analyzing residue from braziers recovered from the Jirzhankal Cemetery in the Pamir Mountains of western China, a site associated with the easternmost extent of Scythian cultural influence, found something that Herodotus had not mentioned and that nobody had anticipated. The braziers contained not only cannabis residue, but a second compound, hyoscyamine, the active tropane alkaloid found in black henbane, the same plant now identified as the chemical engine behind the berserker phenomenon of the Norse world 2,000 miles to the west. The combination of cannabis and henbane, burned together in an enclosed space and inhaled, would have produced a pharmacological profile unlike either substance alone. The cannabis providing dissociative euphoria and altered perception. The henbane adding extreme agitation, pain suppression, and the auditory distortions that might convert a group of warriors seated around a brazier into men described as howling with pleasure. This was not a bath. It was a preparation. The question of how widely this preparation was used and for what specific purposes resisted easy answers, because the answer required understanding something about Scythian society that the textbook version had never fully confronted. Herodotus described the ritual in the context of royal mourning and purification. He connected it to a class of ritual specialists he called the Enari, a group of men who performed divination, administered ceremonies, and occupied a social position that had no clear Greek equivalent. The Enari were not priests in any Greek sense. They were specialists in altered states, in the manipulation of consciousness for spiritual and presumably military purposes. In the spatial context of the Pazyryk drug, finds placed them almost exclusively in high-status burial contexts. These were not substances available to anyone who wanted them. They were controlled materials associated with specific ritual roles, administered under specific circumstances. The parallel with the Firkat henbane find from the Norse world was not approximate. It was structural, a specialist class, a controlled substance, a ceremony that produced a specific physiological state in the people who underwent it, and a warrior tradition that the surrounding world could not account for by ordinary means. The pharmacological question had a framework. The genetic question was about to overturn everything else. For most of the modern era, the Scythians had been treated in historical writing as a single unified people. The nomadic Iranians of the steppe. Greek and Persian sources describe them as a recognizable cultural bloc, sharing the same ritual practices, the same artistic vocabulary, the same broad language family. Archaeological research in the 19th and early 20th centuries reinforced this picture. The Kurgan burial tradition, the animal-style artwork, the composite bow, the horse culture, these markers appeared consistently enough across a vast geographic range to support the idea of a coherent Scythian identity stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the borders of China. The textbook Scythians were a people, a tribe, writ large, a genetically coherent group who had swept across the steppe from a single homeland and imposed their culture on the lands they passed through. This was a theory built before anyone could read the actual biology, and when the biology finally arrived, it collapsed almost immediately. Ancient DNA analysis of Scythian skeletal remains accelerated dramatically through the 2010s, drawing on the same sequencing technology that had reshaped the understanding of Bronze Age Europe and prehistoric Asia. A landmark study published in 2021, in which an international team sequenced the genomes of more than 111 individuals from Scythian-era burial sites, spanning the entire geographic range of the culture, from the Ukrainian steppe to the Mongolian plateau, found something that overturned the foundational assumption of Scythian identity at the genetic level. The Scythians were not one people. They were never one people. They had never been one people. The genetic profiles of individuals, buried according to identical Scythian ritual traditions, in identical Kurgan mounds, with identical artistic objects, across the western and eastern steppe, were not the same. Western Scythians, the ones buried in the Ukrainian and Kazakh grasslands closest to the Greek colonial world that had described them so vividly, showed ancestry patterns consistent with Iranian-speaking steppe populations and Western Eurasian hunter-gatherer lineages. Eastern Scythians, buried in the Altai and the Mongolian borderlands, carried substantial East Asian ancestry that was essentially absent from their Western counterparts. These two groups were not the same population. They did not share a recent common ancestor. The genetic distance between a Scythian warrior buried in Ukraine and a Scythian warrior buried in the Altai was, in many cases, larger than the genetic distance between a modern Norwegian and a modern Iranian. What held the Scythian world together was not blood, it was a system, a shared cultural technology, a set of practices and symbols and ritual behaviors so adaptable and so effective that entirely different populations adopted it, maintained it, and exported it across a geographic range larger than the Roman Empire at its height. The Scythian identity was a franchise, not a family, and the implications of that finding reached far beyond academic archaeology. The most dramatic implication concerned a question that classical historians had been debating since the 5th century BC, the Amazons. Herodotus described a society of warrior women somewhere to the northeast of Scythia proper. He told the story of their origin, their battles with the Greeks, and their eventual union with young Scythian men to produce the Sarmatian people. He described them as women who rode horses, used the bow, fought in war, and were prohibited from marrying until they had killed an enemy in battle. Greek mythology placed them at the edges of the known world. Greek art obsessed over them. Greek historians were unable to decide whether they were real. The bones had been giving the answer for decades. It simply had not been read correctly. Beginning in the 1950s and accelerating through the 1990s, archaeologists excavating Scythian-era Kurgan burials across the Kazakh and Ukrainian steppe repeatedly encountered a specific inconsistency. Burials that contained weapons, bronze arrowheads, iron daggers, and the skeletal markers of heavy physical labor, specifically the bone asymmetry and muscle attachment points associated with years of mounted archery, were being classified on first examination as male. When the skeletal material was subsequently examined by physical anthropologists applying more rigorous criteria, a significant number of these warrior burials proved to be female. Estimates accumulated across multiple excavations suggested that somewhere between 25 and 37% of Scythian individuals buried with the full warrior assemblage, weapons, horse harness, and battle-scarred bones, were not male at all. Ancient DNA ended the debate entirely. Studies published between 2017 and 2021 sequenced the chromosomes of individuals from dozens of warrior burials previously designated as male by archaeologists working before genetic confirmation was available. The results required a comprehensive revision of the burial records. Female warriors were not a marginal phenomenon in Scythian society. They were a structural feature. Some were adolescents, buried with small bows scaled to their height and daggers proportional to their arm length. Some showed healed wounds consistent with combat injury. Some were buried alongside male warriors in what appeared to be companion graves, two individuals interred with matching equipment. The Amazon legends that Greek historians had treated as myth were, at the population level, an accurate description of a real military tradition. Herodotus had been right. The Greeks who fought them had been right. 2.5 millennia of scholarly skepticism had been wrong. The DNA did not stop at confirming that the women were real. It revealed something about their genetic background that complicated the picture further. Several of the female warrior burials in the high-status Eastern Kurgan complexes showed ancestry profiles that were not local. The genetic signal placed their origins far from where they were buried. A woman interred with the full warrior burial assemblage in the Altai, surrounded by artifacts placing her in the uppermost level of Scythian elite society, carried genetic markers that traced back to populations from the eastern edge of the steppe, more than 1,000 miles from her burial site. She had traveled. She had been valued enough on arrival to be incorporated at the highest level. And she had been buried with the honors due to someone who had earned them. The implication was specific. The Scythian world was not simply tolerant of female warriors as an exception to a male-dominated rule. It was a system that recruited exceptional individuals across vast distances and across apparent biological categories that other ancient cultures treated as absolute boundaries. The franchise model applied not just to ethnic identity, but to social role. What mattered in the Scythian world was what you could do on horseback, not who your father was, not where you had been born, not what sex the person burying you would later incorrectly assign to your skeleton. This is where the textbook version of the Scythians becomes difficult to defend in any specific detail. A monolithic, male-dominated, ethnically unified warrior people who rose and fell as a single coherent civilization. Every genetic finding cuts against it. The Scythians were a distributed cultural system adopted by multiple genetically distinct populations across an enormous geographic range. Their ritual specialists controlled pharmacological substances that converted ordinary people into something the surrounding world struggled to explain. Their warrior class included women who traveled thousands of miles to fight alongside men in a society that evaluated them by the same standard it applied to everyone else. And their disappearance, which the textbooks have treated as an ending, was not a disappearance at all. The collapse of Scythian cultural dominance in the 3rd century BC, driven by the expansion of the Sarmatian peoples from the east and the simultaneous pressure of Macedonian power from the south, did not eliminate the populations that had carried Scythian identity for half a millennium. It dissolved the political and cultural system that had organized those populations. The people themselves went somewhere. The DNA can now show where. Population-scale genetic studies of present-day Eurasian populations have established direct and traceable continuity between the Scythian-era steppe populations and the modern peoples of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The Y chromosome lineages documented in Western Scythian warrior burials, including the elite male burials at Alexandropol and Chortomlik, are present at measurable frequencies in modern Ukrainian, Polish, and Romanian populations. The Eastern Scythian genetic contribution traces into the ancestors of modern Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and Uyghur populations. And the population known today as the Scythians, an Iranian-speaking group living in the Central Caucasus between Russia and Georgia, carry a genetic profile that researchers have repeatedly identified as the most direct modern analog to the ancient Scythian Western steppe population. The Scythians have their own oral traditions claiming Scythian descent. The DNA confirms what the traditions preserved. The berserker parallel here is precise and worth stating carefully. The institution ended, the men did not. Scythian cultural identity, the kurgans, the animal art, the specific ritual practices documented by Herodotus and confirmed by 2.5 centuries of archaeology, dissolved under historical pressure in the 3rd century BC and did not recover. The political structure that had organized the steppe world for 6 centuries fragmented into the populations that replaced it. But the individuals who had carried that culture, the warriors, the ritual specialists, the women buried with their bows, their children and their children's children persisted. They were absorbed into the Sarmatians and the Alans and the various successor peoples of the steppe world, and those populations in turn were absorbed into the medieval and then modern populations of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The genetic thread from a tattooed Scythian warrior prepared for battle with a brazier of henbane and cannabis has not broken in 2,500 years. It simply stopped being called Scythian. The name changed. The bloodline did not. The contrast between the textbook version and what the evidence now describes is stark enough to require a direct accounting. The Scythians of the standard narrative are a unified ethnic group of nomadic Iranian warriors who rose, dominated, and vanished. The Scythians of the genetic record are a distributed cultural system adopted by multiple genetically distinct populations, held together not by shared ancestry but by shared practice. The ritual specialists administered psychoactive compounds that produced specific physiological states on demand. Their warrior class routinely included women who traveled extraordinary distances and were buried at the highest levels of social honor. Their cultural influence stretched from Greece to China and shaped the artistic vocabulary of civilizations that outlasted them by 1,000 years. And the populations that carried their genes are alive today, in exactly the regions where they buried their dead. 2.5 millennia is a long time to misread a people. What made the misreading possible was the absence of the evidence required to correct it. The bones have been in the ground the entire time. The DNA has been readable for 20 years. The technology existed. The questions had simply not been asked with enough precision, or the answers had not been taken seriously enough to revise what was already written. What the Scythians were, in the fullest sense that the evidence now permits, was something the ancient world recognized and feared and admired without ever fully understanding. A system for producing extraordinary human beings from ordinary populations across vast distances, regardless of origin, regardless of sex, organized around a shared set of practices powerful enough to hold together a world without walls or cities for 600 years. The rider on the steppe, the pouch opened before the battle, the substance burned, the man who mounted his horse afterward. The textbooks will tell you he vanished sometime around 300 BC along with the civilization he represented. The DNA tells a different story. He had children. His children had children. The chain is not broken in 25 centuries. The Scythians did not disappear. They simply stopped being Scythians, and their descendants are still out there in the same grasslands, in the same mountains, carrying in their cells a record of everything that was done in those Kurgan fields before the world forgot to look.